afternoon, ma'am. Once again.
This is fantastic. A congregation already of almost 25 people. And why I waited for the number 25, because I told Ted that it'll be 25 to 30. This is fantastic.
No, they may just be arriving from their schools or probably just gathering themselves up.
Absolutely, absolutely. Congregation already of almost 25 people. Yes. So may I request Alka ma'am to start off with the presentation so that Archana, welcome.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Dipinder, Archana, good afternoon all.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon,
sir.
Fantastic.
Advantage of Zoom, virtual meetings.
Such a joy, such a joy. So I think I would like to begin with the fact that Ted pointed out, I like the nomenclature of progressive. And I think that's what the GPSC defines and portrays. We are a global organization rather than just Gurgaon, but as a cohort of principals in Gurgaon, we wish to spread our wings, but keep to our roots, of course. And yes, Alka ma'am, the next one, please. Yes, we can skip this one.
No.
Right. May I request Dipinder ma'am to please say the prayer?
Yeah, before I say the prayer, I'll just give a gist of this Ardas in 2-3 sentences. Ardas of Sikhism was first composed by the 10th Guru, Guru Gobind Singh Ji. And Ardas is done before performing or after undertaking any significant task. It is a prayer that remembers God and the 10 Gurus and asks God to bless the Sikhs and the complete humanity. It remembers those who remain steadfast on the path of Dharma and remembers their glorious deeds. May the merit of this remembrance be happiness of all kinds, and may all of mankind prosper according to his will. Vaheguru, Vaheguru, Vaheguru. So I'll say the Ardas. एक ओंकार श्री वाहिगुरु जी की फतेह, श्री भगवती जी सहाय, वार श्री भगवती जी की पातशाही 10वीं, प्रथम भगवती सिमरे के गुरु नानक लई ध्याय, फिर अंगद गुरते अमर दास राम दासे होय सहाय, अर्जुन हर गोबिंद नो सिमरो श्री हर राय, श्री हर किशन ध्याइये जिस डिठे सब दुख जाए, तेग बहादुर सिमरिये कर नाव निधि आविधाय, सब थाए होय सहाय। 10वें पातशाही श्री गुरु गोबिंद सिंह जी साहिब जी सब थाए होए सहाय। 10वां पातशाहियां दी ज्योति श्री गुरु ग्रंथ साहिब जी दी पाठ दिदार दा ध्यान करके बोलो जी वाहिगुरु। 5 प्यारे चाहो साहब जादियां 40 मुक्तियां 8 जपियां तपियां जिन्हां ने नाम जपिया बन छकिया, तेग चलाई तेग वाही देख के अडिल कीता, तिन्हां प्यारियां सचियारियां दी कमाई दा ध्यान करके खालसा जी बोलो जी वाहिगुरु। जिन्हां सिंह सिंगनिया ने धर्म हेत सीस दिते, बन बन कटाए, खोपड़ियां लुहाइयां चरखियां ते चढ़े, आर्यन नाल चिराए गए, गुरुद्वारियां दी सेवा ले कुर्बानियां कीतियां, धर्म नहीं हारिया, सिक्खी केसा सुआसा नाल निभाई, तिन्हां दी कमाई दा ध्यान करके बोलो जी वाहिगुरु। 5 तख्ता सरबत गुरुद्वारियां दा ध्यान करके बोलो जी वाहिगुरु। प्रथम सरबत खालसा जी की अरदास है जी, सरबत खालसा जी को वाहिगुरु वाहिगुरु वाहिगुरु, चित आवे चित आवन का सदका सर्ब सुख होवे, जहां जहां खालसा जी साहिब तहां तहां रक्षा रियाद, तेग तेग फतेह बिरत की पैर पंथ की जीत, श्री साहिब जी सहाय, खालसा जी के बोल बाले बोलो जी वाहिगुरु। सिखा नू सिक्खी दान, केस दान, रहत दान, विवेक दान, विसाह दान, भरोसा दान, ताना सिर दान नाम दान, श्री अमृत सिजे दर्शन स्नान, चौकियां चंडे गूंगे जुगो जुग अटल, धर्म का जयकार बोलो जी वाहिगुरु। सिखा दा मन नीवा मत उची, मत पद्दा रख आपी वाहिगुरु। हे अकाल पुरख अपने पंन दे सदा सहाय, दातार जियो समूह गुरुद्वारियां दे खुले दर्शन दीदार ते सेवा संभाल दा ध्यान ਖਾਲਸਾ ਜੀ ਨੂੰ ਬਖਸ਼ੋ। ਹੇ ਨਿਮਾਨਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਮਾਨ, ਨਿਤਾਨਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਤਾਨ, ਨਿਓਟਿਆਂ ਦੀ ਓਟ, ਸੱਚੇ ਪਿਤਾ ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਆਪ ਜੀ ਦੇ ਹਜ਼ੂਰ ਦੀ ਅਰਦਾਸ ਹੈ ਜੀ ਅੱਖਰ ਵਾਦਾ ਕਾਟਾ ਪੁੱਲ ਚੁੱਕ ਮਾਫ ਕਰਨੀ, ਸਰਬਤ ਦੇ ਕਾਰਜ ਰਾਸ ਕਰਨੇ, ਸੇ ਪਿਆਰੇ ਮੇਲ ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਮਿਲਿਆ ਤੇਰਾ ਨਾਮ ਚਿਤਾਵੇ, ਨਾਨਕ ਨਾਮ ਚੜ੍ਹਦੀ ਕਲਾ, ਤੇਰੇ ਬਾਨੇ ਸਰਬਤ ਦਾ ਭਲਾ। ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕਾ ਖਾਲਸਾ, ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕੀ ਫਤਿਹ।
Thank you so much, Dipinder. Thank you so much. That really created that calmness and that inner peace that we so require. May I now have the pleasure of introducing to you the speaker for today. And most of you must have seen his profile, which was circulated. It was a brief profile, but I'm going to now request Madam Alka Singh to read his profile. But before that, I wish to add over here, whilst we had our 30 minutes of interaction with him before we opened it up to everybody, I could see everybody being selfish and wanting to cling on to every word of his and every aspect of his persona. He is so charismatic. And I was just telling him, I can very well imagine all your students absolutely mesmerized by you because of the way he speaks, the personality that he carries, and the knowledge, the profundity of his knowledge, which I think at least I cannot fathom because he's beyond, he's an ocean in himself. May I request Alka Singh to please read his profile. We welcome you, Professor Edward Warburton.
Thank you so much, Rupa ma'am. Edward Ted Warburton is Professor of Performing Arts, Dance at the University of California in Santa Cruz, CA, and Senior Fellow at Teachers College, Columbia University in New York, USA. Warburton received early training at the North Carolina School of the Arts and danced professionally with American Ballet Theatre and Boston Ballet. His interdisciplinary interest in cognition and creativity began when studying for his doctorate in human development and noted psychologist Howard Gardner. At Howard University, a celebrated dance artist and widely published author, Warburton is the recipient of several awards, including the University of California's Excellence in Research Award and the National Dance Education Organization's Outstanding Researchers Award and Teachers College's Distinguished Lecturer. Thank you once again, Mr. Ted, for being there. I think what ma'am was saying, so I think each one is looking forward to your conversation on intelligence plus creativity, that is innovation. Welcome once again.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ms. Singh. And thank you all for being here. And special thank you to Ms. Rupa Chakravarti for inviting me to talk with you and your colleagues. I consider it an honor and a privilege to be speaking with you all today. And I look forward to our conversation. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see some slides that I prepared that will include some graphs and some performances and some notes that I can share with you afterwards if you like in a PDF, Ms. Chakravarti. I'll make sure that I get those to you. So let me go ahead and share my screen and make sure that you all can see that. Our talk today begins with the premise that intelligence plus creativity equals innovation. Many countries around the world have shown an accelerating interest in the relationship between intelligence, creativity, and innovation, with the importance of integrating these three elusive capacities in their state curricula. One of the underlying drivers of this interest has been the pressure exerted by the Future of Work report, the World Economic Forum's analysis of the impact of the fourth industrial revolution on jobs in the 21st century. It predicted the digital transformation of societies taking hold in many industries and in countries today, showing that the most in-demand jobs or occupations of the future may not, in fact, yet exist. So today, we'll discuss why I believe combinations of intelligences and interdisciplinary thinking are foundational to innovation, as called by the theory of multiple intelligences. And we'll also consider creativity and how to nurture the creative thinking skills required to solve the most complex problems. I am humbled by your presence and your experience, and so I beg your forgiveness if any of the information that I share seems as though it's something that you have heard before, but perhaps maybe my contribution can be to put it in a new light, to look at this from a slightly different angle. And we'll conclude this talk by discussing the ways in which the global COVID-19 pandemic has caused really remarkable changes to our societies around the world, effectively speeding up the World Economic Forum's predictions and the implications for administrators and principals and educators worldwide. Walk into any boardroom of a company and ask the executives there, who is the most innovative employee? And within seconds, you are likely to get virtually universal agreement. Probe a bit deeper, however, and you'll learn that every expert has their own views on what innovation is and how companies can improve it. Some of them even rightly point out that innovation has become a bit of a buzzword, and perhaps we shouldn't be looking for a singular definition at all. That said, if you ask enough thought leaders, as I have, you will find that there are some underlying themes that crop up again and again. And this graph shows my analysis of the most cited aspects of innovation. And you'll see that for the majority of executives, it's a combination of creativity and intelligence. That is, the imagination to have a new idea and the mental acuity to execute on it. Now, walk into any classroom and ask the students who's the brightest kid in the class. And within seconds, you are likely to get virtually universal agreement. So ingrained in our mindset about what constitutes smart that it makes little difference whether you enter a math, English, or music class. Teachers and students alike can identify a particular member as having more brain power than everyone else, as knowing more, faster, and better in those areas that many societies value most, language, math, and science. But ask the class, who's the most creative student? And you're likely to get a vastly different response. She can sing, he can resolve any conflict. Such responses reflect implicitly held beliefs about the nature of human ability. But there is a growing interest in challenging these commonly held beliefs. Today, many thought leaders and school principals want us to ask a new question. Who is the most innovative person or student that you know? The one who is always coming up with new ideas and can deploy their unique abilities to realize them. Now, underlying this shift in thinking has been the pressure exerted by the future of work, the future of jobs, the World Economic Forum's analysis of the impact of the fourth industrial revolution on jobs in the 21st century. The report focuses on drivers of change as indicators of how students should be prepared to participate in the economies of the future. In their survey, business leaders and academics tell us that the top socioeconomic driver is the changing nature of work, which is largely due to the rapid growth in mobile technologies, which is the top technological driver of change. So, though it was written in 2016, its predicted changes have already come to pass, likely sped up by the global pandemic. Indeed, as the digital transformation of societies takes hold in many industries and countries, the authors argue persuasively that the most in-demand jobs or occupations of the future may not yet exist. The report also identifies two legacy issues in education that we must confront. They make clear statements about the need for the kind of interdisciplinary thinking foundation to innovation. The most complex problems in society, as you know, globally, require experts across the humanities and the sciences to work together. Why? Well, the assumption is that these experts will leverage a variety of intelligences and creative thinking abilities to address the actual contents of hard problems in order to solve them with innovative solutions. Now, their stance, their assertion requires a more pluralistic view of intelligence, creativities, and innovations than many schools have had in the past. Now, one of the most influential educational theorists, Howard Gardner, has long argued for such cross-disciplinary integration and a broader understanding of human cognitive abilities. And we see schools like Ms. Chakravarty's who have centered multiple intelligences in their curriculum. And in his book, Frames of Mind, Gardner revolutionized our understanding of human intelligence by redefining what it means to be smart, changing the question from how smart are you to how are you smart? And with this shift, a lot more gets changed than just the simple word order. In comparing MI to traditional psychological view of intelligence, you might find it useful to think of them analogously as if they were computers, so that how smart are you requires belief in a single intelligence, which asks for a single numerical ranking and implies that humans possess a single general purpose computer that will perform better or worse across measures of intelligence. So if you're performing well, you have a high IQ. If you're performing average, you're a normal IQ. Or if you're performing poorly, you're a low IQ. But belief in MI theory implies that human beings possess several relatively independent computers that interact in the cloud, where strength in one computer does not predict strength or weakness in other computers. So that how are you smart asks for a description of intelligence possible, the plethora of ways that learners are capable of demonstrating intelligence, from reading, writing, and arithmetic to public speaking, observing natural phenomenon, making music, and collaborating on teams. One might have high or low musical intelligence, but that doesn't predict whether you would have high or low linguistic intelligence. And so I'll just briefly go over the way that Dr. Gardner talks about these intelligences, because he posits 8 separate intelligences that encompass abilities not previously categorized as cognitive. Linguistic intelligence is what we all know and use every day. We describes the ability to perceive or generate spoken and written language. It's exemplified by poets, lawyers, and journalists. Logical mathematical intelligence involves using and appreciating numerical, causal, abstract, or logical relations. It figures heavily in mathematics, science, and engineering. Spatial intelligence describes the ability to visually perceive spatial information, to transform and modify this information, to recreate visual images. Spatial intelligence is used in astronomy, architecture, navigation, and the visual arts. Musical intelligence is the ability to create, communicate, and understand meanings made out of sound. It can be seen in musicians, but it can also be discerned outside the musical sphere. So for example, auto mechanics and even cardiologists make diagnosis based on careful listening to patterns of sound. Bodily kinesthetic intelligence involves controlling all or part of one's body to solve problems, to communicate or fashion products. It's used for both large and fine-grained motor skills. So for example, athletes are the obvious example, but also surgery and then of course, dance performances. Interpersonal intelligence involves the capacity to recognize and make distinctions among feelings, beliefs, and intentions of other people. High interpersonal intelligence enables individuals to communicate successfully and to work with others. Intrapersonal intelligence enables individuals to form a mental model of themselves and to draw on that model to make decisions about viable courses of action. The core operations of intrapersonal intelligence are the capacity to distinguish one's feelings and anticipate reactions to one's actions. And the eighth intelligence that was not in the original book, but is something that Dr. Gardner has been looking at and thinking about over time, is the naturalist intelligence, which he believes has a separate ability to understand and work effectively in the natural world. Naturalist intelligence is exemplified by biologists, zoologists, and naturalists. The ninth intelligence that Howard has considered but has not yet found enough evidence to include in his theory, but for which I think is a very interesting one to think about, is what he calls the existential intelligence, which is the ability to ask deep questions about life, to look at the big picture, or to think philosophically. Existential intelligence is exemplified by spiritual leaders. And so for all of us, our biological inheritance ensures that all normal human beings possess the potential for use of all eight intelligences, depending upon the opportunities available and the values inherent in a specific cultural setting. So in this way, intelligences aren't fixed, but they develop and can change over time, depending upon culturally specific experiences and education. So not only do we have unique profiles of intelligences, but these profiles of intelligences are changing and interacting constantly, as the diagram suggests. So you can consider the number of different intelligences that principals like you activate during your course of your day. At minimum, I would imagine interpersonal, certainly linguistic, logical, mathematical, to be able to understand the complex operations of the school, spatial, and maybe even a little bit of existential intelligence too. I was very pleased and appreciated the prayer that we did at the beginning, because it grounds us in the presence of each other. So in many ways, Howard Gardner claims that intelligences aren't separated. They can, but they're combined and integrated as they develop over time. Now, over the course of its lifetime, I thought it might be important to share, and Howard often asks his students to share some of the myths about MI theory. And so we'll go through just 3 different myths so that you have an idea of where he comes down on some of the ways in which the misconceptions and misuses of MI have happened in the past. And these myths result in unfortunate pitfalls to be avoided. So he always likes for us to talk about these. And the first one is this idea that it's a practical guide to building the curriculum. MI is a very good rationale, but it doesn't stipulate 8 separate educational objectives for every lesson. He stresses that there are 3 key propositions to keep in mind when considering the role of MI in the classroom. We are not all the same. We do not have all the same kinds of minds. And education works most effectively if these differences are taken into account rather than denied or ignored. The second one that is one that he's often concerned about is this idea of labeling learners as just one or the other. For him, labeling learners isn't as helpful because for him, it's a learning style. Oftentimes we'll talk about intelligence as a learning style, a cognitive style, or a working style, but those are more akin to the way one approaches a topic. It reflects a personality trait rather than an intelligence. a personality trait like introverted or extroverted tendencies. So one way to understand the difference between intelligence and style is to consider someone with strengths in a particular intelligences. So a person demonstrates particularly strong bodily kinesthetic and spatial intelligences, they still must have to decide how to use those capacities. So if she's extroverted, she might choose to be in the limelight as a professional athlete or dancer. But if she's a more introverted personality, she might choose to use her bodily kinesthetic and spatial intelligences in a more private study that leads one on the career path of a graphic designer or a brain surgeon. And finally, the last myth is that now that we've identified these 8 intelligences, we should create tests for every single intelligence. And most pluralistic models of human cognitive abilities grow out of a strong belief in psychometrics, the idea that intelligence is in some way a measurable quality or a quantity. Gardner believes that the intelligences operate in combinations and so can't be independently assessed in a valid way. He opposes the development of a set of 8 separate MI tests. He sees them as integrated and as contributing to a profile of intelligences. Now, the influence of the theory of multiple intelligences and the World Economic Forum report can be found most recently in the state of California's recent embrace of intelligence fair assessments. Just last year, the University of California Board of Regents unanimously approved the suspension of the standardized test requirement, what's called the ACT or SAT, for admission to the university, beginning in fall 2022. And many observers believe that this is due in part to the fact that the SAT and ACT focus solely on the measurement of linguistic and logical mathematical abilities and do not encompass the broad spectrum of cognitive and social emotional abilities that the theory of multiple intelligences and that the World Economic Forum report call for. So the hope is that the university will devise a new assessment system that better aligns with the content it expects incoming students to have mastered for college readiness. And one of those valued areas that the University of California hopes to assess better is the way students' intelligences plus their creativities can bring about future innovations. Now, as I think principals know all too well, helping people flourish is an organic and unpredictable process. Like a farmer sowing seeds, teachers nurture conditions for children to grow as creative and critical thinkers. But creativity can't be taught directly, but educational practice can provide the means, the opportunities, and the fertile environments for the creative mind to flourish. The fostering of creative thinking is not always easy. So I thought I'd offer some simple guidance on some activities, some ways to think about how to enhance creativity and creative thinking in different schools and learning spaces. And my recommendations are mainly taken from 3 sources: research on creativity, research on classroom practices, and then my own personal experiences. And I think this is an important slide to keep in mind, that creative thinking is the prerequisite to creativity, something that enables individuals to apply their imagination to generate new ideas, new questions, new hypotheses, and also allows them to experiment with alternatives and to productively evaluate their own ideas and their peers' ideas, thought processes, and final products. So when we think about bringing creative thinking to school, we begin with 3 basic assumptions. All subjects are creative. Creativity is not only a privilege of the arts or of people in the arts. Creative thinking can be fostered and demonstrated in all school subjects and curricular areas. One of the main barriers to creativity in schools has been the heavily charged curriculum. And we need to rethink the traditional division of school subjects and skills to design more flexible, balanced, and less extensive curriculum with a provision for diverse activities like community projects or online magazines. These are cross-curricular activities that can nurture creative thinking and learning, but they also require contributions from students and teachers with different backgrounds, competencies, and expertise. The next key assumption is that all teachers can be creative. Even the most detailed and traditional curricula do not tell teachers exactly how to teach. Even the so-called hard sciences can nurture creativity in students, provided that the pedagogical approach allows for the expression of creative thinking and imagination. From the creativity perspective, there is considerable freedom for teachers to decide for themselves what and how they teach creatively. Often, original explanations of facts and challenging comments on traditional knowledge by themselves can be creative ways of viewing otherwise non-exploratory subjects. These and other forms of student participation should be encouraged because they can be eye-openers and they can lead to non-conventional ways of thinking. And finally, and sometimes this one is left out of our ways of thinking about creativity. And it's that we can influence creative thinking through well-designed learning spaces. The way our learning environments are designed have a significant impact on creative thinking. Learning spaces can bring people together and encourage their interaction and creative collaboration. Just consider how even seemingly trivial details like furniture arrangements or the materials used or the technologies that are available can be instrumental in achieving positive experiences that determine learning outcomes, while also ensuring the well-being of students and teachers. So even in a typical school with standard classrooms, teachers can and have worked out creative arrangements for a variety of working spaces that encourage the active involvement of students. Perhaps, I imagine many of you have already encouraged teachers to design together with their students 2 or 3 basic classroom arrangements, one arrangement for the whole class lesson, one arrangement for teamwork or project-based activities, and one arrangement for independent work. These arrangements demand really very little time and minimal moving of furniture, and the students themselves can be empowered to participate, to make the changes and transitions. And these days, more than ever, when I speak to teachers, especially the creative teachers, have been especially adept at utilizing new technologies in innovative and cost-effective ways to transform even the most conventional school buildings into stimulating learning spaces. So I've seen video projectors creating inspiring and easily read large text on the sides projected onto the sides of school walls with inspiring quotes from famous people, or teachers taking their class on an international trip to any location in the world without leaving their classroom by using the internet. There are incredibly creative teachers out there using their spaces in really innovative ways. And now I'm just going to mention 3 important areas that we think about when we look at the research on creativity in classrooms. And the first one is, if we want more creative classrooms, we must engage learners in meaningful activities that are challenging and authentic. Those are the ones that are most likely to generate interest and engagement. Learning and creativity, as we know, are outcomes of hard work, of determination and persistence. Creative students are more likely to express their potential when they're involved in meaningful and authentic activities that fit their personal interests and abilities, and that are also intellectually challenging. When students have the potential to learn or to create something, they still need incentives to do so. But those individuals who are intrinsically motivated tend to be more willing to spend the required time and energy to be creative than those individuals who are driven more by external rewards, pressures, and inducements. And this is what research shows us over and over again. So how do we make them intrinsically motivated? The creative teachers find out through conversation with their student what arouses their interest, what motivates them. And then they use that information for designing meaningful activities and authentic tasks of different types, whether they're visual, auditory, or kinesthetic, that motivate all students and increase their engagement. It's most important here to allow students to make personal choices and to contribute to the decisions that they see relating to their own learning. We know that to advance effective creative thinking in students, the pedagogical approach is far more important than the content of the activity itself. Even trivial content can activate creative thinking, provided that the teacher allows for idea generation, experimentation, and sensible risk-taking. Teachers spend a great deal of their time asking students questions, and that's good. And there are many different types of questions that they use. But the research has shown that the main distinction is between close-ended questions and open-ended questions. Closed-ended questions test comprehension and aid retention. Ask questions like, what is the capital of France? Open-ended questions have many possible answers that can promote creative thinking because they require students to go beyond the facts. And what's interesting about this is that research has shown that on average, approximately 60% of the questions, the large majority of questions asked in classrooms, are in fact closed-ended. They're not engaging students in open-ended creative kinds of questions. So what do we mean? What are the kinds of open-ended questions that we can invite our teachers to do in their classrooms? If we want more creative classrooms, we need to increase the use of open-ended questions. These are the kinds of questions that help students develop creative thinking by applying, analyzing, evaluating, and synthesizing information and knowledge. And one of the most effective ways to stimulate that creative thinking is by selecting different kinds of questions that probe the reasons and the assumptions that students have in order to engage progressively higher levels of thinking. So for students, we want to focus on seeking clarification when they give us an answer. So could you explain further, why is Paris the capital of France? Can you give a counterexample of a city in France that's not the capital, but maybe was at one time? We also want to challenge their assumptions. What do you think is behind the assumption here of why Paris would become the capital of France? We want to probe their reasons and evidence. Why do you say that? How do we know that? We want to explore alternative viewpoints. What's the counter argument? Looking for implications and consequences. But if Paris suddenly disappeared from the planet, what else could result? What other place could become the capital of France? And we want to ask about the question itself. Why do you think I asked that question? Why was that question or problem important to ask in the very first place? And for teachers, I think we need to remind them that simply asking more open-ended questions doesn't necessarily lead students to produce higher order responses. And one of the key tips is to encourage them to increase the wait time for the answers. So once we ask the question, to give students time to think it through and come up with their answers, because that creates a positive climate by tolerating the time that the students are thinking it through and then encouraging original responses. And obviously, we want to ask students whenever you can to explain how they came to their answer. I've had students who just say I just know. But then when we start to probe, it's their understanding and their answers based on their prior knowledge, or it's inspired by another situation. And that's important information for them to know to become more metacognitive thinkers. And then finally, it's so important for us to treat these students' questions with respect and interest. Sometimes we get asked questions that we just can't even believe that they're asking. But if we respond in a negative way, then they start to shut down, and then they won't come forward with their creative ideas. So we want to reward and assess not just their answers, but also the fact that the questions they're formulating and that they're posing are questions that they have from themselves. Now, you know that I'm both a dancer and a researcher of cognition and creativity. So I'm going to provide some examples from dance that I hope will illuminate the promise and the possibilities inherent in these open-ended kinds of questions in different disciplines. And one important source of my inquiry derives from my participation in a project called Arts Cross, which was a multi-year collaboration among professional dance artists and academics from the cities of Beijing, London, and Taipei. And this collaboration had a double focus. On the one hand, 9 choreographers from the 3 cities, so 3 choreographers from each city were selected to work with mixed groups of dancers who are also from the 3 cities. And they were tasked with creating a 10-minute dance piece based on a theme. So for example, when we were in Taipei, dance makers were asked to create a piece based on the theme of uncertain, waiting. In Beijing, it was light and water. And in London, it was leaving home, being elsewhere. So on the one hand, we have 9 choreographers and we have our dancers, and they're making a 10-minute dance piece. But on the other hand, they invited a cluster of academics, myself among them, to gather, to observe, to reflect upon, and then exchange ideas about the creative process, what we were seeing in the work itself, and how it was being created and how it evolved. So I want you to consider the dancers that you're going to be watching now. Now, what I didn't tell you is that the choreographers had just 3 weeks to completely finish their work for a public performance. Now, normally, professional choreographers have at least 6 to 8 weeks to create a dance work. And so because of this time-pressured situation, several of the choreographers that we invited opted to make a dance prior to arriving. And then in a very close-ended way, simply taught the dancers the pre-made work. But not so in the case of the dance we see here. The choreographer told me that he wanted the dancers to create performances that were complex, both horizontally extended over time and vertically, multi-layeredly complex at any given moment. He did not want them to simply memorize a set of steps. So to do so, he needed a more open-ended approach with dancers participating in the creative process itself. Now, this choreographer was a master teacher who knew how to ask good questions. He was also very patient. He increased the wait time for answers from his dancers, sometimes for hours. The dancers who participated in these more open-ended works were highly motivated. The tasks he gave them were authentic, and the dancers got to ask questions that were meaningful to them. They got to explore the movements at length and discover for themselves the expressive ideas that were implicit in the choreography, such as the quality of a hip rotation or a twisting torso. Their movement ideas added layers of detail and texture and color to the dance that made the choreographer very happy. We'll come back to this dance in a minute. But I want to say one other thing. Oops, there we go. That if we want creative classrooms, we also need to encourage collaboration. Motivation and insights and novel ideas arise mainly during our interactions with others. Collaboration develops students' abilities to think both independently and with others. It enables them to consider a wide range of perspectives, and thus they increase their creativity potential. So it's important to keep in mind that creative thinking is not only a characteristic of individuals, but also of groups, of organizations, of communities and even societies. Creative teachers can encourage collaboration and facilitate students' collective creativity by emphasizing the role of the individual and the group. So, for example, teachers could ask students to list a number of inventions in the history of science or discoveries in history or geography, and then ask students to analyze them, determining if those inventions or discoveries were the outcomes of individual or collective efforts. They can also engage students in reflections about the role of others, such as peers, teachers, parents, and even principals in their own creative achievements. And then we can acknowledge that diversity is an opportunity for learning in general and for creativity in particular. Formulating mixed groups of students with diverse backgrounds, with diverse interests and diverse intelligences will ensure a plurality of thinking within the group and expand the possibilities for creative collaboration. So we want to provide students with as many opportunities as possible to collaborate with peers, both virtually and face-to-face, those in the classroom and those beyond the classroom, particularly experts and artists and scientists in order to bring these kinds of creative projects to a successful conclusion. Now, I'd like to return to that dance we started with. And this, what I showed you before was the dance in progress in rehearsal. Now I'm going to show it to you on stage in London. This is the London edition of Arts Cross. And the question really was, what else did the choreographer do? Beyond inviting open-ended questioning process, what did he do to make the work successful? Now, in rehearsal, the only thing the choreographer told his dancers was where and when to begin and end. He did not offer any explanations about tempo, which is a pretty important subject in dance. The choreographer began with a structured improvisation task to build the dance vocabulary. Then in rehearsal, he put the dancers as a group into situations where they had to make decisions as a collective about how to perform the material without any musical reference. Now, often, by default, movement timing is determined by musical tempo. So by withholding the musical content, the choreographer invited the happy accidents that arise unintentionally every time the dancers performed. So the dance starts as it continues, as it ends. 5 women clustered in a pool of light, frond-like arms wafting through the air, heads and torsos and legs slowly, deliberately turning, folding, and twining. Feet inching the group on a diagonal while the swell and ebb of ambient sound bathes the stage. Ultimately, the choreographer and the dancers collaborated to create a dance that became one of the favorite dances in the festival. Let me see if I can get that sound back so you can hear a little bit of it. You can see here that they move from one end of the stage all the way to the other end. Now, as administrators, I think one of the things that we have to recognize and share with our teachers and our students is that creativity is an attitude towards change. A flexible and practical mind willing to play with forms and ideas and turn them upside down in order to achieve a better future is a creative mind. Creating and enjoying a good life while looking for ways to improve it through problem solving is a habit of the human mind that can be generated, developed, and sustained over a lifespan. We nurture creativity and creative thinking in students and teachers by rethinking schooling and reflecting on how new educational futures can be imagined in more progressive ways, by re-examining what students learn, how they learn, where they learn, who they learn with, and from whom and why they learn. So we can use a diverse range of skills and subjects when they're learning. We can use alternative learning approaches and methods such as game-based learning or instructional design. We can change where they learn in any location within the school building, in the classroom itself or a common space, or even outside of the school in the youth club or even in the street. We can change when they learn. They learn formally in school hours and they learn outside of school in informal settings at any age. And who they learn from, not only from teachers and classmates, but also with a range of other people, such as their peers and experts and people who live near or far from them. And finally, from whom and why they learn. They learn not just for themselves or their future employers, but also for their fellow citizens, for society and industry, and for the world, really the world as a whole. Now, up until now, I've talked about intelligence, creativity, innovation as a kind of wide open thinking. And that's the common way of thinking about creativity, and it's an important way to think about creativity. It's true that at the University of California, we value possibility thinking as a foundation of our inquiry. We ask, why not? And pose what if questions. We encourage researchers and learners alike to be curious and to consider the possibilities. But like this clever cartoon, creativity is often misunderstood. So this is a man looking at his cat, obviously probably living in an apartment. So he has a litter box for the cat. And he's saying, never, ever think outside the box. So people think of creativity as motivated by unbridled possibility thinking that leads to beautiful effect. But just as the frame of the cartoonist, just as this frame shapes the cartoonist problem space, this is the cartoonist's own box that he can never think outside of. Innovation is defined by intelligent solutions to constraints on creativity. Constraints on creativity. While unfettered possibility thinking may be good for the beginner, it can distract those seeking original solutions to hard problems. As one gains experience, as you know, true originality can be increasingly hard to achieve. Free to do anything, most of us do what's worked best in the past, what's succeeded most often in the past. But successful solutions are mostly reliable. They're not surprising. Successful solutions are mostly predictable. They're not novel or creative. So a few years ago, I began to research what happens when we constrain creativity. How can constraints act as barriers that lead to breakthroughs? And this imperative shifts us from generating a lot of questions to choosing the right problems. And this is what I call the innovation problem. To solve for the innovation problem, we must leverage our intelligences and our creativities and appreciate that learning takes place within the constraints that are embedded in the very questions we ask, as well as within the constraints of the subjects we study, the people we learn from, and the spaces within which we work. So allow me for a moment, excuse me, to return to Arts Cross to expand on this idea of constraints. This clip is from the Taipei edition. As in London, this choreographer wanted to use a more open-ended approach, but he didn't want the dancers to ask questions about the movement. He wanted the dancers to innovate, to use their bodily kinesthetic and spatial intelligences to create new movements. And to do this, he presented dancers with very specific constraints on their movement. He asked the dancers to move without traveling through space. Oops. I didn't mean to jump that. I apologize. So the choreographer here is interested in the shaping of space. He wanted the dancers to explore their physical materiality, to design lines around their bodies. And by giving them this task that constrains their use of general space, of traveling, he confronts the dancers with the problem of how movement can start at any point in the body and travel through space to another point in the body. And if you watch closely, this is what he called the point-to-point method. It can be perceived as lines drawn in space. And the choreographer's genius in this task constraint was to ask the dancers to generate novel point-to-point methods that they could then use to create the perceptions of lines drawn in space. And now some are better than others, but you can see them struggling with this task because they can't travel, they can only move within their body. Now, more often than not, truly innovative individuals find that the more constrained the solution paths, the more variable, the more creative the problem solver. So the more constrained the solution path, the more creative the problem solver. This is a lesson I learned personally the very hard way. A few years ago, I was approached by the astrophysicist, Greg Laughlin, who was here at UC Santa Cruz. UC Santa Cruz has one of the foremost astronomy departments in the world. And now Greg is now at Yale University. But at the time, he was working on a demonstration of something called the Pythagorean three-body problem. First posed in 1893, this classical astronomical problem of three bodies is very easy to state, but very hard to solve. What happens when three bodies with masses of 3, 4, and 5 are placed at the vertices of a 3, 4, 5 right triangle and allowed to fall toward one another due to their own gravitational pull? So this simple physical situation would occur, for example, if you take 3 planets and put them into space with the correct masses of 3, 4, and 5 and distances. And it turns out, if you put 2 bodies in space, they pull together, the gravity pulls together, and they bounce, bounce, bounce until they collide and explode. But when you have 3 bodies, it turns out the bodies don't simply collide and collapse. Instead, they execute a series of complex interactions and spatial patterns. And the arrows describe the gravitational pull of the bodies, which is constantly changing. When bodies 4 and 5 pull together because they're the heavier bodies, body 3 goes on a long arcing pathway out and then pulls body 5 back in towards it. As Greg described it, the solution to this problem is as difficult to comprehend in theory as it is to solve in practice. It's just too abstract. He argued that a physical embodiment would better capture the emotional narrative in the differential equations. And when he said emotional narrative in the differential equations, my eyes crossed because I had no idea that math had emotion in it. But he does understand it that way as a narrative. And he believed that a physical embodiment would render the solution more comprehensible to students. He told me that he needed a more interdisciplinary approach to solve this problem, working with someone who could bring a different perspective to it. It would make a great dance, he told me. I wasn't so sure at first, but I began to have more belief as we began to have more conversation. And in this visualization, you can see how the mathematical solution literally determines when and where the bodies travel, effectively constraining the choreographer's choices about spatial arrangement, acceleration, and trajectory, both for the mathematician and the choreographer alike. So 3 bodies is what we called the project, and it began as a dance-based studio exploration. We worked with graduate students in math and astronomy, and with undergraduate students in dance. And our solution was to use the given conditions of space and time and pair them with the constraints of a specific dance style. And in this case, I chose a tango. And if you look closely at the video, you'll see that the way that the dancers learned the timings and the spatial directions was that we projected them down onto the floor. So very faintly, you can see this is a rehearsal where they're still learning the space and time trajectories. So traditionally, the tango is all about dramatic tension, and the tango is always performed as a duet. So our innovation was to elaborate the tango style as a dance for 3 bodies, and thus created a dramatic trio that explored feelings of longing and connection and isolation as these moving bodies are flung apart by the same gravitational forces that draw them together. And this is right back to the beginning that we saw of the original diagram. So we're coming to the conclusion of the formal aspect of the talk. I'm looking forward to the conversation. But I wanted to close by thinking with you together about the future of intelligence plus creativity equals innovation. Because it's important to recognize how much the global COVID-19 pandemic has altered societies around the world, effectively speeding up those predictions of the World Economic Forum. Everything from email to e-commerce to social networks have hinged on the internet's transformative role in changing the economics of communication, education, and innovation. And one provocative example of this future is the fact that digital content creation is fast becoming a desirable and increasingly legitimate career path. And I recently read a market report which stunned me. It said more than 50 million people worldwide consider themselves online creators and part of the so-called creator economy. This is the fastest growing small business segment globally. And for many, it's becoming a really desirable and legitimate career path. It's open for debate, though, whether the many new creators are really prepared for the all-consuming aspects of the work. Social media like Instagram or TikTok are lauded for their technological innovations because these apps can deliver fame faster than any other online platforms. You know, it's theoretically possible to amass millions of followers within matters of weeks. But along with the celebrity that our youth are experiencing comes the draining work of building, maintaining, and monetizing an audience over the long term. And if you read the popular press, is awash with tales of online content creators who quickly rise and fall as other creators step in with new ideas and step up the pace of production. And then, moreover, once creators achieve a certain level of notoriety in the social media universe, they can encounter all kinds of problems, including discrimination and harassment, issues of intellectual property, appropriation, and compensation have become major concerns. So ultimately, I'm ending by appealing to you as educational administrators and instructional staff to say that I think we need to grapple with the implications of this new future for our students who are being faced with technological applications and social media platforms that act as high-speed vehicles into the future. And our questions today, the questions we've considered today about intelligence, creativity, and innovation, the answers that we provide to those questions will determine, I think, whether our students thrive or whether they simply survive in the landscape of what has been called the new normal, the new life. So with that final thought about the future, I would like to open it up for questions and answers, and I'll stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think like we said before, there would be so much of profundity that it would take time for it to get internalized. And thank you so much. I loved with what you ended. It will determine whether we survive or we thrive. And that is so applicable to our students. Thank you so much, Professor Warburton, for this fantastic, profound, and very, very mind-boggling, I'll say, examples that you've given, the linear and the part where you kind of draw people and have them go away from you. That was something I think it's not something people think of normally. But thank you very much. And
thank you.
yes, I'll request everybody to ask the questions they wish to.
Guneet ma'am?
Yes, I think I'm floored completely. So much information rightly mentioned by Rupa ma'am, so much to absorb. But what I think I really resonated with was leaving the world or the inquiry open-ended. Because if we leave it open-ended, we get some fantastic, inputs from children which take us in different directions. And having said that, the constraint of completion of syllabus is the only thing that probably holds us back. Otherwise, I think we would go, I think, completely into various areas which are, there for them to explore. So I just want, my question to you is, in your part of the world, do you have curriculum constraints? Because we feel that it is there for us, at least out here.
That is an excellent question. Thank you. And absolutely, we do. We have a very constrained or charged curriculum with science, technology, engineering, and math. And teachers find that they are frustrated sometimes with trying to cover all of the content. And the way we talk about it is to say that that's a constraint, but we can find creativity within that constraint by offering opportunities for students to ask questions or to have an open-ended question about the particular concept or idea under study, so that it isn't always about completion or memorization, because then they begin to understand how the ideas fit together in different ways. And so it's a challenging task for sure. And I think that the best examples that I see are when teachers come together who teach that subject and have time, that's another thing, time is so precious, have time to talk about places where they see openings to open the box rather than close the box within the curriculum. But it is absolutely true that that is the challenge we see. More and more standards, more and more curriculum, more and more content. Yeah, but the reality too is that we ask our students to memorize, and yet at their fingertips, they can get those facts and those answers. What they can't do is they can't learn how to critically or creatively think about those facts online, right? So they can get the facts online, but online instruction can't teach them how to think critically or creatively about that. And that's why I think, you remarkable principals who are working in this progressive way are very farsighted in thinking about how to provide students those opportunities. But thank you. It's very much a challenge. I agree.
Good evening, Professor Warburton. My question to you is, you rightly very beautifully essayed how the human potential within a child turns into a human performance. But what do you think should be the level of competency that a teacher should have to drive this change and to trigger this creative attitude, as you say, which is rightly going to take hold of the world?
Oh, I think that's of course, Rupa, you told me these were incredibly brilliant people. These are both fantastic questions. Of course, no one can be an expert at everything. And so one of the questions that comes up around the idea of intelligences and creativity is that, well, I may have strengths in certain areas, but I don't have strengths in all areas. And so it's, I think, important to be able to think about how the strength that you bring as a teacher into the classroom can be an example of how an expert works through a problem. And that then you can expand that to think about areas that you don't have expertise in, but that students are interested in, and that you can then follow through on. And so that it's not always this sense that you have to teach only what you know, but that you can also show that the students that you are willing to take a risk to teach things and think through critically and creatively areas that you don't know as well. And I think that model is really incredible for students. I fail regularly in my class. And my students—
Thank you so much. Yes, very rightly said.
My students forgive me, and they and they learn that I use those failures to make myself better. So the example I thought for me that was the very hard project was the project with the astrophysicists who came forward with very complicated mathematical calculations that I had to keep asking again. Every rehearsal, I had to ask him to remind me, how did that work? And it made everyone feel a little less intimidated. I'm not sure I still understand the math, but so I would say failure is okay if we don't shame people, if we really understand that, even Albert Einstein talks about the importance of that. Yeah. So I hope I answered your question a little bit.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Next question. I think before we let you go, we would just like you to end with something very intriguing you were talking about before we got onto the meeting. And that was a part of your research, or is a part of your research, about the character, the emotional character building and things like that, with creativity being, kind of piggy riding on that aspect of learning or character building. So if you could just throw some light, I think that would be fantastic before we wind up the session.
Yes, thank you. So we were talking about one of Howard Gardner's colleagues, his name is David Perkins, is very interested in this idea of intellectual character and what it means not just simply to know how to do things, but to have the habit of mind, the disposition, the desire and motivation to use that information, to be curious, to ask the open questions, to be disposed to do those things. And I thought that that was a really helpful way of thinking about how character, the character of our students, can be developed intellectually. But then in conversations with artists and others, I began to think about the idea of emotional character. That is to say, the ways in which we relate to one another, and how we have a propensity or a disposition to express feelings that create connection. Whether we're connecting our feelings to our own sense of self, or to others, or to society, or even really these days to the natural world, and the need to have the emotional character to care for our natural world. And so this idea of emotional character that I'm developing and thinking a lot about is this idea that it emphasizes the intentionality of how we feel our bodies and how we express our emotions to one another. And this is different than emotional intelligence, because emotional intelligence is more emotional intelligence came out of Yale University and psychologists. And then Daniel Goleman wrote a best-selling book called Emotional Intelligence. And he talks about stable capacities that govern predictable behavior, where it's in a sense emotional. My ability to read you is an aptitude, read your feelings, right? But emotional character is not strategic use of feelings. It's not me thinking about your feelings. It's not me thinking about my feelings. It's really about me feeling and expressing those feelings to you that create some kind of real, authentic connection. And so I was so happy to hear the first questioner who said the piece that resonated with her. To me, resonate means that she felt something that intrigued her, that sparked a thought. And that bodily feeling, that emotional feeling, I think is something that our physical body is giving physical signals to us all the time. You know, they happen unconsciously. If you're experiencing fear, you might instantly start panicking and sweating profusely. But all those feelings will be instantaneous. But once the fear's gone, you'll be perfectly fine. So emotions are those basic fear-based or anger or happiness, right? So emotions come and go, but feelings stay. The feeling of that fear stays in our body for a lot longer than that. And so the ability to use those feeling dispositions to lead towards better and more powerful expressions of felt experience so that we can connect to each other, to our world, is something that I'm really interested in terms of how it describes why some people are better. Emotional character describes why some people are better than others at making those kinds of connections. So it's a habit of mind, feeling habit of mind, but it's something that I'm really very interested in that is a complement to intellectual character. Absolutely. Thank you for asking about it.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Is there a moment?
Yes, just a quick moment. Yes.
Yes, a quick one. Professor Warburton, don't we, as teachers or schools, willy-nilly teaching will happen. Across oceans, there's a gamut of knowledge that teachers, I think schools should not worry nowadays because of the exchanges. But the thing is that out of these intelligences, shouldn't we more concentrate on the interpersonal relations with the short fuses, people not being caring, so much of violence around? Should we teach our children more of sharing, caring, forgiving, a little more of kindness and loving? Classrooms should probably change to make the world a better place, because learning should now leave the focus that was maybe in the 18th, 19th centuries. Learning was more important. Subject learning, that. What is your comment on that? Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. Yes, this is the notion behind emotional character. When we were working on that interdisciplinary project with the astrophysicists and the astronomers and the mathematicians, they struggled with the dancers to express the import of the underlying narrative in the math, and they realized that they were struggling with the interpersonal connection, and that once they were able to begin to feel together the work itself and begin to express interpersonally, then the group itself came together very quickly, and the problem was solved in a very creative way very quickly. But it really was because they had, as they expressed to me, not had a lot of experience working with other people, because they're mathematicians and usually they were only alone by themselves, not working with others. And so those experiences, those interpersonal experiences, maybe with a little existential intelligence in there too, I think are really valuable, and I think key to sort of the creative envisioning of our future. We won't survive, I don't think, unless we can come together and develop our emotional character, because the problems are too complicated, and one person cannot solve them all, and that one person needs to know how to work with other people in order to solve those problems. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Namaste, as we say here in India.
Thank
And,
you. Namaste.
We'll be in touch, and we expect you to be kind to us again, maybe in the future, and share more and glean more from all that profundity that is there in your knowledge. Thank you.
Well, I have much to learn from you all. So hopefully at some point you all could teach me as well. Thank you so much.
We'll see you in India maybe soon.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.